This is the second concurrent session. This is Facilitating Scientific Discovery with XSEDE. Our speakers are Phil Blood and Brock Palin. This is a 90-minute session, and a brief note that this is being recorded, so the presenters are going to repeat your question so it can be recorded. And take it away.
Thank you. Well, I'm excited to be here at University of Michigan. This is my first time here. I've had the pleasure of working with Brock Palin through some organizations that are part of XSEDE, which I'll be talking about today, and so you'll hear more about that later, and I'm glad Brock can be here and share with you some things that are specific to Michigan with respect to XSEDE and integrating with XSEDE. So he'll talk about that later, so it's definitely worth sticking around, even if you're bored to tears with what I say. So stick around for Brock, if nothing else, but hopefully this will be of interest. And if you have questions as I talk, please don't be bored because I'm not addressing your particular question. Please interrupt me and ask your questions. And if I'm going to get to it later, I'll let you know. But just you might as well ask, and we can keep it interactive and hopefully keep everyone awake with the afternoon doldrums here. So I work at the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center, which is run through Carnegie Mellon University and also in collaboration with the University of Pittsburgh. My official title is Senior Scientific Specialist there, which means, as you might suspect, that I do a little bit of everything. So my job really is to interface with scientists to figure out how to facilitate science using cyber infrastructure or supercomputers or whatever you want to call it. My background is that I was a user of these systems at one point. I did my PhD at the University of Utah with Greg Voth doing molecular dynamics simulations and used these systems extensively. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal experience here because I can talk more passionately about that than anything else with regards to what can be enabled using these high-end resources that have been made available in the past and which are now evolving into this new program known as XSEDE. So the question that we'll start asking today is, how do you create a cyber infrastructure to facilitate scientific discovery? And we heard a lot about cyber infrastructure, that's CI days, during the previous sessions. And, this is going, and how do we maximize the potential that we have to do great science through computational means. And so when I thought about this question, I thought about a quote that I had heard. Oh, and I gave away the question I was going to ask there at the bottom unintentionally. But I was going to ask if anyone could guess who said this. Did anyone already know this before I put it up there? But I think there's a lot of wisdom in this. I heard someone else say once that Henry Ford said something similar, that he said, if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they would have asked for a faster horse, right? So sometimes people don't know, and we have to figure out what they need to do and then figure out the best way to help people to do that. So we have a big challenge there because there's such a wide diversity of things that people are going to be trying to do, both in terms of the computational requirements that they have, how they like to access these resources, what needs they have in terms of collaboration and the workflows that they have to do, and also just where they're at in terms of interest in and experience with computational resources. So we want to facilitate the greatest amount of science, then we want to make this available and accessible to everyone. So that brings me to my second Steve Jobs quote, that if you do ask what they want, that by the time you actually build it, then they'll want something else. So not only are we supporting a diverse environment, are a diverse set of needs and users, but those are also constantly changing. So there's this moving target with advances in software and hardware technologies and also in the experimental technologies. And we heard a little bit about, well, people have been hearing a lot about bioinformatics and genomics, and the changes in the sequencing technology is changing the type of data and the amount of data that they have to work with. And so that changes the algorithms that they need to analyze the data, and that in turn changes the type of support they would need in cyber infrastructure to be able to address the problems that they are now able to address because of these great advances in technology. So how do we deal with that when we develop sort of a comprehensive national infrastructure? So who here has heard of the TerraGrid? Okay, so most folks here have heard of the TerraGrid. So this was the first. Well, there's a long history of NSF-funded supercomputing centers, but in terms of creating, so TerraGrid started out as an experiment for creating a federation of these supercomputing centers that would work together to solve problems in science and engineering that couldn't be solved easily with just a single computational resource. And that evolved into a coordinated network of supercomputing centers with expertise at solving these problems. Recently, that project finished, and the next phase of that project, which originally was solicited as TerraGrid 3, the third phase of TerraGrid, has been now awarded, and that is now known as XSEDE, which stands for Extreme Science and Engineering Discovery Environment. So just a little bit of background on XSEDE and what what was involved with this. The take-home message from mostly slides, hopefully with a lot of text or things you can look at later if you're interested. But there's a take-home message that it's very complicated. Okay, it was a very complex solicitation with all kinds of different aspects to it in terms of the actual hardware and different types and a diverse set of hardware resources, and then a solicitation for integrating all those resources together. And all of this played out over a couple of years, and actually the two competing proposals ended up being merged together to finally form the winning proposal, which was XSEDE. And the vision here is to do what we asked in that first question on that first slide, which was how do we facilitate scientific discovery and enhance productivity of scientists. And so the design of XSEDE is explicitly set up to address those challenges that we talked about in terms of the diversity that has to be addressed in what people want to do, and also in the flexibility that we need to have to address ongoing and changing requirements. So this is just an example of the wide breadth of science that we are trying to support, and this is only a subset of that. And we have all different forms of computing, from things that require a petascale machine to a bunch of single processor jobs or very small parallelism jobs that require a lot of high throughput, data-driven problems, and everything else you can imagine. So the idea behind XSEDE is to create. We heard today when we had the NSF panel this term ecosystem. This is something that that's been set up as a model for what we want to do with cyber infrastructure. So this really is what XSEDE is about, is creating a framework or an ecosystem where we can gather together all the different components that we need to address this very diverse requirements. So the other aspect of this is that we are trying to do, in XSEDE, we have a formal methodology for collecting what the requirements are, so asking users what they need to do, and then trying to figure out, as we said, the best way to do that. So So we're trying to think of all the ways we can to do that, from surveys and just looking at how people complain, ticket mining, to focus groups and usability panels, but also directly interviewing people and just watching people work and seeing what they're trying to do. So hopefully we can, again, not just ask people, what do you want, but trying to do, and then look at all the options that are out there and try to figure out the best way to meet the needs of people in diverse research areas. So there's a formal user requirements evaluation and prioritization process, this UREP, that is used to change these requirements that we identify into actually the architecture and the cyber infrastructure that is deployed. So this is basically what I just explained, that each of XSEDE will be motivated by some requirements that we've identified. And we'll try to do this in such a way that as we go forward and the technologies change and the requirements change, that we'll continue to evolve and change the architecture based on the new and revised requirements that we get from the communities that we're trying to support. So in the initial transition from TerraGrid, really, so XSEDE just started. The funding came down July 1st. It was set to start. I think the money was actually released July 21st or something like that. And so that was when we all breathed a sigh of relief. And yes, the money was there. So it's very new. So the things that we're talking about are, the vision, right? There's a plan to execute to do what we just discussed. But the components are currently being developed. So the first mantra of this new era, this transition from TerraGrid, is that we're attempting to do no harm to those users who have been happily using TerraGrid and it's meeting their needs. So that was there in TerraGrid, as much as possible, will be maintained, and those who are using TerraGrid will be able to continue to do the same things they did before. And as a first cut at expanding now to bring in a more diverse and broad group of scientists and to help facilitate greater productivity in the scientific discovery process, we're taking some initial steps. So one of these is creating some new ways of accessing the resources. So these all have acronyms, of course. So XSEDE User Access Services. And then also through something that we've called the Global Federated File System. So this is something that users have asked for a long time, and that's just one view of their data. So if they're working on their campus or wherever they're at, or wherever they're at on XSEDE, they have access to the data that they need in a global file system. So this is currently being tested and deployed, and will be sort of a first cut at addressing some of the issues of usability and access to these resources. Okay, so just in summary, what is XSEDE? It's going to continue in the same vein as TerraGrid, being an open platform for scientific research funded through NSF, bringing together all these different resources, compute, data, visualization, as well as training and support services, and integrate all these resources via a centralized management using common software and fast networks connecting these sites. And currently, in XSEDE, there are 17 service providers. So you can see them better on this map if we bring in Germany in the corner there. And a service provider is not just someone providing hardware, but they may be providing training or expertise, or it really could be anything that contributes to being able to provide to users the things that they need to take advantage of these resources or to facilitate their science. So this is the current set of service providers that are part of XSEDE, and there's 17 of these, and there are others that we're currently talking with who will be coming in, and they're over the course of the project, we hope there will be many who come together. So the idea really is to have this fabric, that XSEDE is going to be the fabric to bring together these services in a way that that people can plug into and get done the thing that they need to get done to facilitate their work. So this is just sort of a brief overview. We won't be able to see names in that line, but just to see how it's kind of divided out, there's the central project management, and then there's sort of the core areas of XSEDE, the actual operations of the systems that are involved, and then the basic user services, and then there's these advanced user services, which used to be called advanced user support, but users couldn't figure out if we were talking about if advanced was modifying user or support. So they thought it was only for advanced users, when really it was for all users, but the support was advanced. So we recently changed that to extended collaborative support to better describe what it's really about, which is anything that doesn't fall under here. So there's project or need that requires more than what can be supported through basic services would go under this advanced or now extended collaborative support realm. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So there's this was identified as being one of the best things about TerraGrid was in-depth support for projects with experts in the scientific domain who also had familiarity with the resources and with making them run optimally on the infrastructure. And then there's a big education outreach and component, and this also involves the training component, which is brought in under here. But so training out and efforts along those directions. So one of the things that is interesting about this outreach is an effort to do campus bridging. So something that will be a main thrust of XSEDE, and this idea of becoming a fabric for all the cyber infrastructure certainly in the United States, is to be able to integrate and provide a framework whereby local campuses can also integrate with the national cyber infrastructure, so that if someone is doing research on their campus, they can, like I say, they could use something like the Global Federated File System, which is the first thing, that's going to be the first implementation or the first attempt at doing something like campus bridging. That they have their files on their local system and they can freely move them back and forth between their local system and XSEDE just using familiar interfaces or like a graphical user interface. And not only the files, but also the queues, so that you could conceivably merge the queue on your local cluster with a queue on XSEDE resources and be able to say drag and drop a submit script onto one of the XSEDE queues that you have sitting there on your laptop, and it would submit a job onto one of the XSEDE resources. These are the kind of things that are being explored to enable campus bridging. Also, In Common is being promoted to enable folks to authenticate on their, if a campus is part of In Common, they can authenticate using their campus credentials, and then they'll be already authenticated on the XSEDE systems also. Who here is familiar with In Common and this? Okay, so what's that? U of M is part of it. Okay, U of M is part of it. Okay, so it is basically, for those of you who haven't heard of it before, it is basically what I just said. There's a framework of trust that's developed whereby so organizations that are part of In Common, if you authenticate at one site, then you can move and access certain systems on another campus, or in this case on XSEDE. So the idea of campus bridging is tying together campuses through common authentication and then common access to resources at the local level, making it easier to manage workflows and to get done the things that need to be done. So any questions about that? Brock is going to talk a little bit about, as I said, some of the integration that's already gone on with Michigan and XSEDE, or really it was more the TerraGrid flavor of integration, as these things were sort of being developed in TerraGrid, but it's now going to come be developed more fully through XSEDE. So for the first year, the roadmap is that there's going to be a number of pilot sites that will be identified to experiment with some ideas for campus bridging. So as I said, there's a plan for obtaining the requirements, but what the actual solution will be is not yet known, right? This is something that we need to figure out as a community, is what will best support the work that people need to do. And so initially there will be, I think, 6 campuses chosen through there's a call for participation out, and I'm not sure if that, I believe it's been sent out to through a number of routes, and I'll have to go back and double check and see if there's a URL that I can put in the slides if you're interested. But the deadline is coming up rapidly, so I think December 9th is what was recently agreed upon at Supercomputing. There was a BOF on campus bridging, and that date was set as the deadline. And so there'll be 6 campuses, and the architecture group will be working with those campuses to first deploy this global federated file system and to test that out with these campuses, and also look at other means of doing campus bridging and facilitating that, tying the campuses together with the national infrastructure. Okay, so if you'd like to learn more about the ideas that are driving this, so we just heard today from Ed Seidel during the NSF panel, and during supercomputing he also gave a talk, and he also talked at the last TerraGrid conference. And whenever he talks, he highly encourages everyone to go and read these NSF-A CCI task force reports. And there's a number of different categories that they did these reports on. And one of these was campus bridging. And Indiana, who is heading up the campus bridging effort in XSEDE, produced this report and headed up this task force for the NSF. So if you're interested in learning more about it, you can read that report. And this is sort of the vision of where NSF wants things to go in terms of cyber infrastructure. This report, together with the other ACCI task force reports. So now that's sort of the general overview and vision of what XSEDE is going to be attempting to do. And so now I'd like to get down to the nitty-gritty of if you or someone that you work with wants to actually use XSEDE, where do you start, and how do you get access, and what can you do? So we'll go through that. Before I start on that, are there any general questions or anything that anyone is burning to ask? Yes.
I'm just curious, you mentioned OSG a couple times. I wondered, to what extent XSEDE and OSG will be working together in what ways, because they sort of have the same idea, right, about extending national infrastructure. And OSG, wondered how it fit with XSEDE.
Yeah, so that is evolving, but the plan right now, as I understand it, is that OSG will, so there'll be a relationship that will go both ways. So the users of OSG will be able to access and use resources in XSEDE. And likewise, users in XSEDE would be able to go the other way and use OSG as a service provider. So OSG would become a service provider in XSEDE, and that if you have an XSEDE allocation, you could actually get an allocation on OSG through the XSEDE route, and run. So you'd be able to run on resources that are traditionally associated with XSEDE, but then you'd also be able to run it on OSG resources if you wanted to. So they're currently in discussion and working out the details of how that would work. And I think I have a slide at the end actually on OSG here. But that's a great question. right now that's probably the best example of how XSEDE wants to become a framework for integrating all the national cyber infrastructure together and creating a common framework that people can use to access everything, so that it's not disjointed but all together. Yes. Mention, sorry, what?
Project involving national labs.
Right.
You mentioned MREL in your end.
Okay. Yes. Well, so I think that I think that's the general idea that eventually, Department of Energy and all these different cyber infrastructure in the nation, there'd be some partnership or some means of strengthening that collaboration, of building on shared strengths, and working together in this kind of a framework. So I think ultimately, yes, that's the goal, is to tighten those collaborations and make it easier for people doing science to not care where they are, where their actual resources are, but to be able to access everything sort of in a unified way. And that there's people who are more familiar with the nitty-gritty of that process, will be able to say how soon that's likely to happen. But there's definitely a lot of work to do in that realm. But that's the vision in this. So XSEDE is funded right now for 5 years, but it's renewable for another 5 years beyond that. So it's really as long as things go reasonably well in this first 5 years, it's a long-term project. So I think these will all be questions that will continue to evolve. And other questions? I like knowing what you're thinking, so please. All right. So So let's go through. And again, so one thing that's helpful for me if I'm actually want to go back and do something after I hear a talk is to have a reference in the slides. So a lot of these slides will have a lot of information, and it's there for your reference if you decide to go back and look at it. We'll be going through all the details of all these slides. So as I mentioned, currently XSEDE is now incrementally evolving from what was the TeraGrid. And so we currently have a number of different compute resources. We do have a Condor pool, and so we have some high throughput computing, and OSG is I think soon going to be also a part of that. We have shared memory systems, massively parallel systems, and you can go to the XSEDE portal is a place you can go to find all this information. We have special purpose machines, heterogeneous and data intensive machines, also some web hosting and other things, visualization and all different kinds of storage systems. So I'm just going to briefly give you a tour of what currently is on the on XSEDE. As far as large shared memory systems, at the PSC, we have the largest shared memory system in the world, which means it's got the largest amount of shared memory that can be addressed from a single process. So that's an SGI ultraviolet system, and it's basically 2 nodes with 2,000 processors each, and each having 16 terabytes of RAM. So this has been great for quantum chemistry and some non-traditional types of applications like machine learning, and also genomics that require, as we heard, well, I heard in another session earlier, that require some large amounts of memory to do de novo assembly. And also, we've experimented with this for some data-intensive applications, for example, using the memory as a file system. Since we've got so much memory there and it's fast, we can play around with that, and that's been interesting and educational, and also has actually yielded some benefits. So that's exciting. So right now, there is another UV system on the TeraGrid or on XSEDE, but it's currently geared more. It's geared more towards data analysis and visualization. So I'll hit that in a minute. So our largest systems are Kraken at NICS with over 100,000 cores, and then we also have Ranger with over 60,000 cores. So I just noticed that this is wrong. So I'll mention later that how you can get allocations on these systems. You can actually get 200,000 service units on Kraken. And then we have other systems that aren't quite as tightly coupled as and large as the MPP systems, the massively parallel systems. So there's a cluster called Steel at Purdue, and a new version of a cluster called Lone Star at TAC. And then we have these sort of special resources. We have GPU cluster at NCSA called Forge that's either coming online or is online, just recently coming online there, replacing an older GPU system that called Lincoln that was there as part of TerraGrid. I mentioned the Condor pool that we have for single core jobs, things that require high throughput, and then this Indiana has a system named Quarry that's for web services, and science gateways, which is another thing that I'll mention later. So we've recently also had systems come on that are geared to addressing the data intensive issue, so using solid state drives and virtual shared memory to address some problems in data intensive science. And also this Trestle system also uses solid state drives, but it's also geared to be a high availability system. So it has so it's not fully allocated. So it's allocated about 70%. So one of the common problems on historically with supercomputers is that we wanted to keep them at 96% utilization all the time, which meant that if you had some very fast turnaround work that you needed to do, then you were out of luck. Because if you needed to try your model, and then kind of like Gerhard Klimek was talking about earlier, if you needed to just try something really quickly and experiment with a lot of different things sort of interactively, then the national cyber infrastructure was a terrible place to do that. So we've recognized now that it's okay to waste some cycles if it means increasing user productivity. So Trestles is an acknowledgement of that, and they only allocated about 70% or so, and so there's different queuing schemes, and you can pay more to say do a high. If you have a very urgent job, then you could pay more in terms of service units on the machine. You could pay a higher cost in service units to get immediate access to the system. And on the other side of the coin, if you don't mind if your job gets interrupted, you could run it in a low priority mode, and then jobs could cut in and your job would stop if a high priority job came along. So these are the kind of things that this is a new system that's trying to, again, address some of the diverse requirements of researchers for doing computing. And then we have some other GPU systems that are primarily for analysis or visualization. As I mentioned, there's a couple at TAC, and then also one at NICS, which is another SGI UV system with a fair amount of shared memory. Okay, so that DASH system that I showed earlier is a precursor to a larger system that will be coming on to, again, fill the need for doing calculations that require a lot of I/O. And so this will be a new resource coming soon to XSEDE. And then here's the slide on OSG, talking about continuing to grow the resources that are offered and to federate with other cyber infrastructure providers in the United States. So that's something that will be coming soon also. Okay, so any questions there on resources that are currently available?
So once you get your SU, you can use them on most
So I'll talk. Actually, I will go into the application process here. So let's go ahead and do that. Before I do that, the other resource that you have, which as I mentioned was identified as users as being one of the best things about the TerraGrid, was you have human resources, right? And so you have people who are dedicated to, and there's a fair amount of funding in XSEDE for this what I called it was previously advanced user support, and now that we call extended collaborative support. So I think something like 40 FTEs or something dedicated to this in XSEDE. And so there's different branches of this. This extended support for research teams is in-depth collaboration with a single research group. So you have a problem and you don't know how to get it to work optimally on the current cyber infrastructure, and you can write a little one page or answer a few. I think currently you answer 5 questions describing what you need to do and why you need help, and you get paired up with some XSEDE staff member. Or if one of the neat things about XSEDE too is this flexibility. If we don't have the expertise to help you with your problem, we have a mechanism in XSEDE where we can contract out to bring in other experts and actually pay part of their time to work with you to help figure out how to best use the infrastructure. So that's another example of how we try to build in flexibility into XSEDE to meet the diverse requirements that we're faced with. So that's one mode. We also have people who are dedicated to supporting communities. So building up community codes or community ventures where there's an identified common goal with a number of research groups with a community of users. And part of that is, which is now it's a separate group in itself, but it's sort of related to this idea of facilitating community use of XSEDE, is extended support for science gateways. So who here has heard of a science gateway? I guess as most of us, if we were at the talk this morning with Gerhard, then everyone heard of science gateway. So I'll hit that again really quickly in a second. And then this is something new in XSEDE, and this is, again, addressing this issue of helping everyone and not just the select few physics geeks or whatever it was before. And that is that we have, again, a number of FTEs dedicated to just going out and meeting with and talking with communities of users that have not traditionally used things like the TeraGrid, or at least they may have been using their own cyber infrastructure, and may have been quite happy with that, but we want to engage communities and see if there are things that we can offer through XSEDE that would facilitate their work. So things like humanities and social sciences come immediately to mind, as well as groups that, again, when I suggest to people in bioinformatics that they might be new to HPC, then I've gotten some strange looks. So I think it's not so much. So some communities are new to HPC, unarguably. Others have been doing their own work or their own type of HPC, but have not used the national infrastructure as much, or it may be that they're just facing more significant challenges than they had before, which is in the case again of genomics, where they have this exponential growth in data right now. So is there a way that these national resources can help mitigate the problems that they're experiencing with finding ways to analyze the data that they can now produce? So there's a whole group dedicated to attending conferences, reaching out to PIs. So if you know of such a community, or you're part of such a community, then I'd personally like to hear from you and see if there's ways that we can work together to leverage the resources that are available through XSEDE to facilitate the work that you have to do. So we'll go through this process a little bit in more detail later, but there's, as I just mentioned, so the extended collaborative support could cover almost anything related to getting your science done on XSEDE, and you can solicit this any time through the regular allocations process, which I'll show you in a minute. And if you have any question about whether or not your project or the idea that you have would be a good candidate for this extended collaborative support, then this is the place to just write your question. Easiest thing to do is just ask, and the right people will get that. So we already heard about Science Gateway, and Gerhard this morning showed us a great example of the impact that this can have on a community when all the right components are there. And so I probably don't need to belabor this for this audience if we were there mostly at the, but I guess this is being recorded for posterity. So, so the idea is here to create some interface that's easier than the command line, and that also brings in more functionality and more value to a community that has a common set of goals, right? So, so you might have a web-based portal that people can go to, and there's all the tools are there to facilitate the work they need to do, and they don't care where the actual computation happens. So they click a button and it goes somewhere, and we can use XSEDE resources on the back end, and the scientists never know about it. So as Gerhard mentioned this morning, even experimentalists conceivably could use a system like this to accomplish, to inform their research and their experiments, even if they have no interest at all in the computing aspect of it. So there's a number of forms that this could take. I mean, it could run on a web portal. It could be something running on the user's machines, but then accessing XSEDE on the back end, or you know, something in between. So, so this is sort of what we just talked about. People that have, you know, they have their own workflows or complex pipelines that they have to go through, and you can create a way to help facilitate that. But then bring the power of the national infrastructure to support it. So I'm going to briefly just talk about. So we've talked about how, you know, some of the advanced, I'll still call it advanced support that's available through XSEDE for different classes of users. And I think you know, one of the interesting questions that we really want to facilitate in the communities is to let people take a step back and think about what could I do that I can't do now if I was able to harness this capability, you know, more fully. Just going back to that first quote, that, you know, if they don't know it's available, then they may never ask the question, I guess is the thing. So so this is the case, you know, with my own experience. I, you know, started out, you know, 5 or 6 years ago, and I was doing molecular dynamics simulations, and, you know, this was a common system here to have, you know, sort of tens of thousands of atoms, and I saw this cool molecule that was, the structure was solved in science, but it was this big, long, skinny protein, and I needed something like this to simulate it, which was, you know, a lot bigger than what I'd started at, and so fortunately, the first sort of this, I guess this was the beginning of the second phase, the production phase of TeraGrid had just come online, and so you know, it's sort of, you know, a similar map to what you saw earlier. These were the sort of the main players at that time, and they had this fast interconnect. And so to solve this problem, I literally had to use everything that was available. And it was kind of, for me, it was serendipitous a little bit, because there were some systems that came online that they didn't intend them to be high availability systems, but not many people knew about them. So there were some smaller systems that not many people knew about. So I was able to use that to do the sort of the interactive stuff that I needed to do a lot of, just to get these simulations up and running. And then they had a variety of resources. You know, the smaller ones were good for certain simulations, and then the large ones were required to address the biggest problems. And then, you know, being able to link these all together with the fast network was critical. Having the shared data resources, being able to not have to bring the data home, because it was it would have been that would have been painful. But being able to just keep it on the TeraGrid resources, analyze it there, and just bring back the results, basically, was what I could do. And then, as a result of this, you know, something that hadn't really been considered as a target for simulation, you know, because it was just right on the edge of, it wasn't possible unless you use, you know, something like this, you know, was sort of opened up something new to simulation, and people were then, you know, able to look at a new phenomenon using simulation that they hadn't before. So throughout that process, though, it was the personal support that was the key to success, because, you know, I was sort of working on the edge of where things were at, and having personal contact with then the TeraGrid staff, was essentially able to enabling me to get done the thing that I wanted to do, which I didn't think was possible, a few months before I tried to do it. So I guess that's kind of the take-home message, and I think the vision of how we hope that these resources will come together with a diverse, offering together with the expertise to enable new science. So now I actually do what someone helped me to do back then, and work with groups to improve performance of their codes. This is just an example from my research of doing some performance analysis, or from my work of doing some performance analysis of a code, looking at things like load imbalance, or figuring out how to eliminate things like a serial bottleneck in the code and the load imbalance. And just having this back and forth discussion with this group, one of the interesting things was that the algorithm that they thought was going to be load balanced ended up not being load balanced. But when they went back and looked at their algorithm again, they realized that, hey, that's not even the best algorithm. We can use one that uses half as many operations. And so they were able to come up with an algorithm that not only was better load balanced, but also was more efficient overall. So these kind of collaborations can, it's just an example of how just having that back and forth between someone who's close to the systems and the researchers can help identify problems and maybe just enable people to ask different questions that will lead to better results. Let's see, so just looking at time here. All right, so we're done at 5, right? Okay. All right, so now this is what I mentioned before. This is how to get started, and so if you follow this process, unless things have changed since I made the slides, then you should be able to get started on XSEDE with your own allocation. So the two ways to get started are either get your own allocation or find a buddy who has one, right? And that person can add you to their grant, their allocation. And one of the XSEDE user access services that's being developed right now is this portal, which is sort of a one-stop shop to integrate all the information and access to XSEDE resources. So you can go to, there's actually 2 sites. One is XSEDE.org and the other is portal.xsede.org. But from either one of them, you can access the portal. And so you would just, I think I have a, is this a laser pointer? No, it's not. Where is it? I won't worry about it. So you can just create an account here, get an XSEDE user portal account, and that will be the ticket to accessing XSEDE resources. So these are just, again, like I said, so you'll create that portal account, and this shows you the steps you have to go through in creating the passwords. You do have to prove that you are a human being here, and so that's be a sticky process sometimes. But so then once you log into the portal, you'll be asked to accept. Thank you very much. So then you'll be asked to accept some basic, security agreements and so forth, that you'll use resources responsibly. And then, so if you're going through this process of getting started for the first time, someone asked, I think, if there was a way to search for what's available. So on the portal, you said you're going to have to pick a resource, right? So how do you go about picking a resource that you want to run on? Well, sometimes you might want to run somewhere where they already have your software of choice installed, for example. And so at this, you can go here and you can do a search for the name of the software, and it will show you all the sites that have the software installed currently on XSEDE. However, sometimes you might want a particular system, and in that case, almost always, we can honor requests to install new software or do whatever's needed, pending, license restrictions and that sort of thing. So this just shows you how that comprehensive software search works. So if you're looking for the package R, so this shows you all the sites that are reporting to have it installed. It's possible that this is getting better and better and more inclusive. It's pretty good now, but it's possible that you may find some sites that haven't reported having it installed, but it's becoming more of an automated process. Okay, so you find, I showed you earlier, there's also a resources tab. I'm not sure if I'll show that again. But you can also go to something similar where you can look at the characteristics of all the different resources. And so then you go to this allocations tab and you'd click on submit request, and it'll ask you if you want to submit an allocation to POPs, and POPs is the allocation system. So, so then you'll see something like this, and there's a couple of different types of allocations that you can currently get on XSEDE. One of them is a startup allocation, and this has a certain limit, but it requires, but actually it's pretty generous limit, and it requires only an abstract and a CV to get started. And then they do peer-reviewed proposal, research proposals quarterly. So these are reviewed continuously, but for large requests, you go through this peer review process, which is done quarterly. So that tells you when that happens. So here you can request what type of allocation you want to get, and you can also, sort of similar to the startup, would be something like an educational grant where you can get time to do classroom instruction using XSEDE resources. The PI would need to be someone at U.S. institution, and that could be faculty or staff, including postdocs, but cannot be a graduate student, unless the graduate student has an NSF fellowship, actually. So that's the graduate research fellowship students are the one exception to that. And so then you fill in your information, you write a single paragraph explaining why you need access to the resources, and then you pick the resources you want. And you can pick as many of these as you think you'll have use for your single allocation. If it's a startup, though, then you have to check the limits. So overall, there's a 200,000 core hour limit, and each machine has a specific limit too. It ranges from 30,000 to all the way up to 200,000 core hours. So you can check that here. If you go to here's the link I mentioned where you can look at the different resources. You can click on the name of the machine, and you can check what the limit is for the startup request. So then you upload your CV, and in 1 to 2 weeks, you'll have access to the machine. This tells you how to add users once you have your allocation, where to go do that. You can do that all through the portal. You really can get a lot through just these startup allocations. That's 200,000 service units. That would be 22 years on a single core. So it's not bad for just a CV and an abstract. It's really quite easy to get started. And then the idea would be to use the information that you gain from using the startup allocation on whatever machines you chose to then apply for a larger grant. You can apply, though, for extended support, for human support, advanced support any time, even during the startup allocation process. You can ask for that. That's one of the resources up here. And you just answer 5 questions, and then that will be evaluated. Okay, so I'm going to fly through here. This talks about this gives you this kind of a get started guide. Okay, if you plan on using XSEDE, or if you're interested later in getting on XSEDE, of how to get there. You can access it through the portal. There's a Java web client that you can sign in to XSEDE just by clicking on these machines' name that you have an account on, and that will get you there. You can also download a desktop client that will enable you to do that. And Brock's can actually, I think, show us how to do that, right, Brock? Okay, so I'll leave that to him. And then once you get there, it's like running on any other sort of batch system, submitting jobs through a batch mechanism. This describes sort of when you get a compute allocation, you automatically have access to like a Scratch file system space and a home storage space, and some systems have a mass archival storage, like the PSC and NCSA have archival systems that you can and Texas. So a number of different so these can also be sometimes allocated on their own without access to the compute resources too. So again, this is just showing how to submit the jobs. Most systems use modules to load different software for use on the system. And then, these are the different ways you can go to get help. There's a 24/7 number you can call, and you can email, and you can also submit tickets through this portal mechanism. I also just wanted to point you to there's training online through the portal here. Go to training, and there's a bunch of great online training programs, and we'll be doing in-person training and workshop throughout. That'll be a big focus of XSEDE also. So you can go to a calendar here and look at what training is currently going to be is scheduled to be offered. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to Brock at this point, so he can have time to show us what he wants. And then if we have time, we can come back for further questions, and we can talk about other things if time permits.
Okay, so am I good to go? I'm Brock Palin. I'm one of the system administrators at the Kane Advanced Computing Group. We're actually the group in the College of Engineering that currently runs the Orky Flux resource. How many of you in here are actually using Flux or using some sort of Orky resource? Okay, so some of you are, some of you aren't. And so how many of you are graduate students who would actually be laying their hands on these resources, or PIs that like to get their hands dirty and actually run stuff? Okay. Okay, so some of the stuff I'm going to be showing here is actually meant to be practical for people who are actually using systems. There's just, for those of you who aren't going to be using systems directly, just keep this in mind and set up a time with me. We'll do training with your users. So I'm involved with XSEDE and before that with TerraGrid as University of Michigan's Ann Arbor campus's what's called Campus Champion. Campus Champions is a program involved as part of the outreach parts of the XSEDE program. What does this do? I get access to certain types of TerraGrid data. I have an allocation on any resource so I can help users at Michigan with this. So when you think about the kind of support you get when you use Flux, I can provide close to the same support on XSEDE resources. What I can't provide, I have direct access to the people in XSEDE who do have that kind of access. Also, I can help you just test something. If you're just curious if something works on an XSEDE resource before going through the allocation process, a lot of times I'll just jump on, take a sample case of yours, and throw it up under my allocation, just make sure it goes. So there's a few things we also go along with here. So we have an XSEDE webpage that provides UMich-specific information about XSEDE. There's nothing really new here. Everything that's on here is the same stuff that Phil just talked about. What is XSEDE? Where do you go to get allocations and stuff like that? So I'm going to ignore that for the most part now. One thing I can't stress, Phil brought up a little bit, but I keep getting emails. Hey, I'm interested in TerraGrid. TerraGrid's no more. There's only XSEDE. But that said, for those of you who were using TerraGrid or were looking at TerraGrid and like, oh, TerraGrid's no more, it's like, for most people, nothing really changed. In fact, if anything did change, you'll find that it's better outreach, better interoperability between machines. All the same resources are there. If you find a press release for when Ranger and Kraken went into this and it says TeraGrid, fill and exceed into blank, nothing's changed. So what is the relationship more so between Flux as a machine specifically and XSEDE specifically? Flux has a very specific allocation model, right? Remember how in Ken's talk this morning, the minimum unit of time is 1 month and you pay for the allocation, not your usage? XSEDE, on the other hand, you get allocations that get deducted based on usage. So there's two different things here. With Flux, there's a little more expectation of service. But you kind of have resources all the time you're supposed to be consuming because you're paying for them all the time whether you're using them or not. XSEDE, on the other hand, you can do these big bursts. So I spoke with 2 different users of XSEDE that we have currently. One has a relatively large allocation. This is Dr. Katsio Thornton in Material Science and Engineering in the College of Engineering. Her lab currently has, across all of their allocations, 1.8 million CPU hours allocated to them. And she actually wrote a paper, and I have a link to the journal where that paper was published, where she actually encourages material scientists to apply for XSEDE time. Here's the interesting thing, though. Dr. Thornton's group is a heavy user also of the CAC resources. So how does she use them differently? They're working on scaling their code up, so when it comes to code development, they're using Kraken, and they're running at a scale of 4,000 cores. Flux was only 2,000 before today. So for that one group, for one run, they would have consumed 2x the amount of resources that the entire Flux is. But they only do this in a bursty manner because they're doing algorithm development. So they have burstiness where they want to use a large number of cores for a short period of time. If you have special needs, Flux is not for everybody. It's a very traditional, what I would call like a neoclassical high-performance computing platform. It's a cluster. It has a scratch file system of a traditional parallel form. There's 4 gigs of core per of memory. XSEDE, on the other hand, large shared memory systems like Blacklight, large core counts like Kraken, highly coupled networks for high performance parallel communication for large core counts. Kraken is a craze system with a torus network, which is, ignore torus, but all that means is super special, expensive, and fast. So when you have these other types of need, this is where XSEDE comes in. So myself, as being an admin, user consultant, whatever you want to call me, I don't care what resource you use. You have a problem, speak with us, and we'll look at the different resources that are available. We have another user who is taking advantage of the Condor pool. They have a large set of parameter sweeps, many small jobs, in this case single core jobs that run for 70 hours. They need several million CPU hours of consumption. Right now they're in the process of debugging a couple of steps, but they're putting it all in the Condor pool, and XSEDE people have been helping them out. I've been involved just from the inception of, oh, have you thought about using this resource? From there, the XSEDE Condor specialists have kind of taken over, and I just check in every now and then and see what's going on. And if something gets hung up, like he hasn't gotten a reply, he pings me, I ping XSEDE, everything keeps moving. So I am the person in between, and I come and do training. So if you got a lab and you want to get started with this, I can come and show you. I'll actually show you a little bit of the stuff we've done for interoperability. Because, like example, like for Dr. Thornton's group, they're using Flux kind of as a launching platform up to XSEDE. We have done a number of things to enable logins from Flux and file transfers to and from Flux. For those of you who are engineers, we've also, the same thing applies to NICS, but I'm going to focus on Flux, but everything's the same. But there is one thing I want to point out right now. Currently, from January 1st, 2010 to the current day, there are 43 PIs in the XSEDE database that have, from U of M Ann Arbor campus, who have an allocation. This totals about 22 million CPU hours that have been allocated. Most of those are just startup allocations, the 200,000 hours. Many users actually find that 200,000 is all they need, because that's actually a decent amount of resources. I actually went to Dell's website and I looked up the building block unit that we build Flux out of and got a price for what the building block unit is. The building block unit is 48 cores, 192 gigs of RAM. It's actually 4 nodes. That's why it sounds like a lot. It's actually 4 nodes. And I figured out what the cost for that is. And then I extrapolated that out to 200,000 CPU hours, assuming a 5-year lifetime. Startup allocations worth about, where is it here? $2,200. just for the hardware. No staff, no power, no network, no storage, no software, no support. That's just the hardware. So that startup allocation, and it's easy. Oh, it's so easy. Everyone I talk to are like, oh man, that startup allocation, it was easy. Abstract, CV, done. 2 weeks, login credentials, I'm going. The other thing we do at the CAC specifically is we look a lot towards XSEDE and certain national resources for how are they architecting their systems, their batch systems or schedulers. And we try to make our system look similar. So if you're already familiar with the queuing system on a local resource, you go to XSEDE, it's going to look pretty similar. There'll be some changes, and we can help you with that. So one downside there has been, there appears to be a lot of people who get XSEDE allocations and then don't use them. This is really disappointing to me. So I want to stress for you in this room to go and tell other people, and when you look at getting XSEDE allocations for yourself, if it ever gets hung up, call me. I will get you going. Like I said, I support you same on XSEDE as I do on Flux. So let's actually get our hands dirty a little bit. I want to show you a little bit, a collection of tools that we've set up with XSEDE and Argonne National Laboratory to do 2 different things, transferring data and for logging in between systems. So I have here a login shell on Flux login. Can everybody see this? Is that big enough text? Should I blow that up more? That good? Okay, so the first thing you need to do is you run module load TCT. And this is all documented on our website. If you search for XSEDE or TCT on our website, you will find a page that documents all this. But there's going to be a single command that you run that gives you a credential that lets you log into any XSEDE resource that trusts it. So all you run is myproxy logon minus L, your XSEDE username. In my case, is bpalin. So it's going to ask me for my password, which I store someplace else. So this gave me a certificate that now will let me, for the next 24 hours, log into any XSEDE resource without a password. Yeah?
So, by the way, so that myproxy password is the password that you would get when you get an allocation on XSEDE. So when you get your startup allocation or whatever, that's your XSEDE portal password.
Yeah, this is the password you get when you get your first allocation. Or, no, actually, now is when you get your portal account, which you can just get any time. Yeah.
It wouldn't work until you had
An active allocation?
you wouldn't be able to log into any resource until
Yeah.
you had an active allocation. But it's actually a password that you will set when you get your allocation, when you get your account on the portal.
Yeah, when you log into the portal website to see what allocations you have, submit a new allocation, see what resources are busy, anything on the XSEDE portal, it's the same username and password. So you don't have to remember yet another password. After this, it's actually relatively straightforward. You get just a login host that you would normally SSH into as a user of one of these sites. But instead of using normal SSH, you use GSI SSH. And so if I wanted to go to Ranger, I would just do that. And yesterday, Ranger was actually kicked me out, but it's no longer in maintenance. So here's something interesting about this. I did not specify a username. My username on Ranger is actually something really weird. It takes care of all of that. So there's a corresponding command that goes with this. There's GSI SCP for those of you who like to transfer files using traditional SCP. And so you can log, as soon as you get your TerraGrid credentials, you can start moving data back and forth between the 2 machines using GSI SCP. This also works for the archive resources. Phil mentioned like the data archivers at a couple of the sites. They all have GSI front ends also. So you can move data back and forth between Flux and one of TerraGrid resources very easily. Here's something that's interesting. I've done some speed tests between Flux and some of the TerraGrid resources. The data center Flux lives in, it happens to be the same building that Internet 2's office in Ann Arbor is in. So we get some interesting behaviors. I can get faster data transfer to PSC in Pittsburgh and to NCSA, you know, in Illinois, and to Texas than I can to a lot of places on campus. The maximum speed I've gotten so far, because of constraints I have, is only about 300 or 400 megabytes a second, which is 3 or 4 gigabits. It actually took multiple machines to get that. And we are upgrading connectivity for the Flux transfer host to 10 gig. And so we're working with ITS, the capability to be able to move data, massive quantities of data, back and forth between XSEDE resources and the Flux resource. And I'll show you in a bit, your own lab resources has expanded greatly. So for those of us who like, you know, graphical interfaces or want to easily move large quantities of data, there's actually another resource made available that is not specific to XSEDE. It is not specific to U of M, but we both use it. There's a service called Globus Online. Globus Online is a data transfer service. So how many of you have ever heard of Grid FTP? Okay, so Grid FTP removes a lot of the performance bottlenecks for transferring large quantities of data, especially over long distance networks. Traditionally though, the Grid FTP command line tools, they're convoluted. You end up with these big nasty commands and stuff, and tuning them for performance is relatively fun. Yeah, fun's one way to put it. Globus Online gives you a nice web interface for interacting between these servers. It also makes installing a Globus endpoint significantly easier. Installing a Globus endpoint on my laptop using something called Globus Connect took me less than 5 minutes. Does not require any port forwarding or firewall rules, and takes advantage of all the capabilities that Globus offers, such as restarts if a network goes away, and the ability to transfer files using a heuristic, or if you're moving fewer large files or moving many small files, it tunes things differently. And so you no longer have to know these crazy, nasty command lines, and you can have a nice little graphical interface. So let me actually demonstrate this. Where the heck is my mouse? Sorry, I've got notes down here so I remember to talk about stuff. Oh. It wasn't ever on that screen, that's why. Okay. So registration for Globus Online, because it's not part of XSEDE, is free. We're actually working with Argonne right now where you'll be able to log in using your UMich Kerberos credentials. That's not done yet, so if you want to use this now, you have to sign up. It's free. And they actually have the ability to attach other credentials. Once you've signed up once, you could practically forget that password, and you can log in with your XSEDE credentials or your Google credentials right now, actually. They try Google as an authentication provider. I actually use their local one, so I'm going to go ahead and log in here. And this is what you see when you first log in. So if you want to start using Globus on your laptop, it supports Linux, Windows, and Mac. You want to click this Get Globus Connect, but you only have to do this once per machine. And I already have Globus Connect running on my laptop, so I'll use it as an example here. But to do a file transfer, you just hit this Start Transfer. This looks like what you normally see when you're doing file transfers, right? One machine on the left, one machine on the right. Click a file, say go over here, and it goes. Now I actually already have endpoints set up here, but here's how it looks. You'll notice it has a name here of, let me blow this up a little bit more too. Hopefully it doesn't start formatting funny. There's actually something called UMich pound flux. That's the Flux endpoint. So if you want to send files from Flux, you go UMich. Oh, here's the UMich endpoints, Flux. And it will show me my files on Flux. On the other side, you'll notice it actually says Brock P. That's my Globus Online username. That's this laptop right here. I'm on the regular U of M wireless network. They don't give me any special network or firewall access rules. But by turning Globus Online on here and going to this website, I can send files to my laptop on a relatively restricted network without having to look up what my host name is, my IP. I don't have to do any of that. So this whole thing of I don't know, it's just shows up now and it just goes. So the other interesting thing about file transfers using this, it's in a batch form. Every file transfer you do is a single request. And so you can see a bunch of my old requests here. When I say transfer a file, I can then close out, log out, go home. And it keeps trying the transfer. So you want to move 3 terabytes of data to an XSEDE resource, and you know it's going to take a couple of days. You say go, you log out, you go home, and it just keeps trucking along. If the network goes out, and when the network comes back, it retries. If they shut down the remote endpoint and it comes back up, it retries. It also has minimal rsync-like capabilities where you can say only move files that are newer, only move files that don't exist, only move files that don't match a checksum. It gets heavier weight as you go. What kind of performance can you get? Basically whatever your network can provide, because it's still grid FTP in the back. And if you don't know what grid FTP is, just think faster than traditional.
Can you show them one of the XSEDE endpoints?
Yes, so actually I'll go back to that. So let me make a transfer. So start a transfer. So there's a whole list of what's called public endpoints, because you can have public and private endpoints, because you can add your own endpoints. So like, I know some people here have their own grid FTP infrastructures right now that are currently not in this. You can add them. I'm not going to go into those kinds of details, but you can add them. Also, if you want to have what's called a Globus Connect multi-user endpoint, this is a full-featured grid FTP server on a machine in your lab for multiple UMISH users. Let me know. It takes about 20 minutes. I'll work with your admins and we'll get it set up. And so then you can have UMISH pound your lab. And you can move between there. But let's actually show XSEDE endpoint. So XSEDE has their own space, pound. And then so here's all the different, here's Forge that he mentioned. Here's Dash, here's the Condor pool. There's Blacklight at PSC. So it's always, it's XSEDE, pound the machine you want. So if I wanted to go to Ranger again to transfer files, wait a minute, what? I'm looking at it upside down, sorry. Oh, thank you. That would be why it doesn't exist. Okay, this is something new actually. But normally the first time you connect to a new endpoint that's different certificate, it logged me into a UMISH Flux because I had already logged into Flux once. Just like that, my proxy logon thing I did, they live for some amount of time, and then file transfers don't require a password. So they're actually requiring me to log in here once, so I'll log in with my TerraGrid credentials. And something screwed up. I've never seen this before. It did not do this yesterday.
It usually takes your Globus Online credentials?
It actually pops up a thing, and I just put in my TerraGrid username and password.
Okay.
So I don't know. They changed something recently. But normally I would put in my credential, and it would just go. This worked yesterday.
If you use your XSEDE, if you log in with your XSEDE password to Globus Online.
Yeah, it might actually already have it. Yeah, I'd have to log out and stuff. But so all the XSEDE endpoints are there in the end. There's actually a lot of other ones. NCAR has a bunch of theirs on there also, and you can also add your own. There's also a full CLI for doing this from the command line, so you can script up transfers and such. So this gives a nice graphical interface for moving files back and forth, and we've set up a UMISH endpoint on Flux so that you can transfer files using this service back and forth between TerraGrid. There's one other service that I'll mention briefly, but its future is unknown in XSEDE. University of Indiana provides a service called Data Capacitor WAN. It's a global file system based on Lustre. We actually mount it on the Flux login node. So if you have a Data Capacitor WAN allocation from Indiana, And it's mounted on other machines, some of the XSEDE machines. You can just copy data from Flux straight into that directory, and it just shows up on the other one. There's new services coming, like the Global Federated File System, and I think that's probably part of the reason that service is still undecided what's going to happen with it. And so we're looking at all these things to try to make it as easy as possible. What we want to avoid is moving large quantities of research data from Flux to your desktop back out, because the local networks are not necessarily built up to the same degree that the data center networks are. And so avoiding extra transfers and making it as easy as possible is the main thing we're trying to accomplish here. So my proxy logon with GSI SSH lets you log in to XSEDE resources from a Flux host easily, not having to go through any type of Java interface and stuff like that. And Globus lets you transfer files between them in a batch manner. So again, Globus is not specific to XSEDE. You can use that between your laptop and Flux. You can use it between XSEDE and your laptop, or XSEDE and NCAR, or XSEDE and OSG. Any combination, they all work.
But it is an official part of the user access service.
Yes, yes.
XSEDE, so it'll be supported.
Yep, it's a supported way of transferring files back and forth. So I think that's actually everything I had. Sorry, it was kind of shotgunny. Questions? Yes?
For making one question. So,
Yeah.
with that startup of XSEDE allocation, how much, or do you get archival storage?
Right. So what do you get when you get a startup? So right. So you'll get the compute time. So on any machine that you get an allocation on, you'll have a home directory. You'll have a scratch space, like the scratch file set with a high performance. Usually you'll have some sort of high performance parallel file system, which data is not. So home directories will be backed up. The scratch directory is not backed up, but and it's also purged. Right. Now, in terms of the archive, it used to be that pretty much every system had an archive. That's not going to be the case anymore. Certain systems will have an archive directly attached, to their locally to their systems, and then others won't. So if you have an allocation on at a center that has an archival system currently there, then you would automatically have access to that archival system for as long as you had a compute allocation on it. Okay. Now that's not sustainable unless you. So these are all yearly allocations, right? So you have to renew your allocation at that center every year to have continued access to your archived data. So that may or may not be sustainable for you if you migrate from resource to resource, depending on what you need to do year to year. Then you might have an issue there with where am I going to store my long-term data. So this honestly is a larger issue, with NSF funding and everything else. And right now there is an allocatable storage solution on TeraGrid, archival system, where you don't have to have a compute allocation. You can just get archive space, and that's at NCSA on the MSS system there. But the current funding for that system is only guaranteed for the next year. So this is a high this is a high pressure point, I think, right now in XSEDE and in NSF in general. We're talking a lot about data, and yet we don't have sort of persistent storage space for archiving things.
So those different resources, different centers, they use different methods to access archival storage.
Right. Yeah. Right. In general, that's true. Yeah. In general, each of those centers has a different way of doing it. Now, part of XSEDE's vision is to have a comprehensive way of dealing with the archival system, and right now, that's something that is being worked on. It's not right now. We have the individual archival systems at each site, and what will be the solution that we come up with, the final solution, which will be hopefully better than what we have to work with now, is up in the air. So, but that's a goal and that's a target, for for the architecture, for the requirements that have been set forth in XSEDE. So who knows? I mean, if you're these other centers, so Pittsburgh has an archival system, and TAC, and NCSA right now. So I think, and San Diego's is being phased out. So right now, it would be a good question to bring to XSEDE is what are you going to do about that? And if since user requirements are driving everything, I think everyone knows we need this, but if people open the discussion, then that's always helpful. And also, maybe some of these other centers would have to step up and provide, some, these archival. So I'm not promising anything by saying that, but we do have. Once every center doesn't have, an archival system, then we just have to start thinking about, how are we going to do that? Traditionally, everyone has had one, and things are changing. So.
So if I can add, we do have a couple of users who have gotten XSEDE allocations specifically for archive, and with very, very light or sometimes no compute. It's rare, but it does happen because some people have large quantities of data that is not compute intensive, but they need to keep around. Also, for the different interfaces, you can use, at each site they have documented the specific, this is SGI's based archiver, so it has these commands. But almost all of them, actually I think all of them have GraphTP front ends, so you can use this as a consistent way of accessing data in and out of archives. Because almost all of them are HSM based systems where it goes into something that looks like a disk with infinite number of bits behind it.
Yeah, for Pittsburgh that's true. I know for sure that you can access, and for NCSA also you can access via the grid FTP mechanism. So that's a good way to get things in and out.
How do you encourage faculty to open dialogue? Because with NSF data management plan, and it needs to provide access to the data and the population recommendations that we have. And there is concern that they don't have the money to provide stored classical advantage period.
Okay, so you and I, we've talked about this before. That is a problem that is much bigger than anybody in this room. I don't know, Phil can throw in, but this is more opinion than anything. But that's both a legal problem and a directive problem.
So can you tell me briefly your background and where you're coming from with that question?
I'm the IT manager for the Atmospheric Oceanography Space Sciences Department in Florida.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I think Brock is right. I was talking recently with some people in XSEDE, and yeah, it's I mean right now I think there's everyone's perplexed, but I think it would be good to bring, just bringing that up with and being part of the discussions that are going to be happening with XSEDE, is I think one way to think about addressing it. That's XSEDE wants to either so there are some projects out there. There's and there's a project called DataNet, and I don't know if you're familiar with that.
There's a couple of domain-specific ones. I can't think of them either, but sometimes if you just are lucky enough to be working at a domain, there's already a repository for places where you can say, like, this is where I'm going to publish my stuff. And by publish, I mean data, not papers. So, right. And you'd put that in your plan. Sorry. And
so something like DataNet could conceivably, or one of the DataNet projects could conceivably become a service provider in XSEDE. So this is one possible way. I think NSF wants this to happen, right? They do want to fund some solutions for data, and so XSEDE as in this vision of being the integrator of all of these different services and infrastructures and things. Conceivably that could be one way to address it. And so I think we say, how do you get people to discuss it? Events like this are a good way to bring together people with common interests, and then if you send me email with your specific concerns, I can escalate it to people in XSEDE, or you can talk directly to John Towns. It's bigger than like Brock said. It's not something that then it has to go up to higher levels than that too, right? But I know that we are I know that people in XSEDE are certainly concerned about this issue and are working to find solutions. So So just let us know. There's a in general we have a, and this is probably not for this particular problem, although in general, if you have things that you'd like to see in XSEDE that aren't there, in addition to help@xsede.org, there's a feedback at xsede.org. So help@xsede.org is, I'm trying to use this feature and it's broken or something. And feedback is more like, you could really improve your service by, offering this, or this works, but it could work better if it did this kind of thing. So, so you can, send, for general things, you can send feedback that way.
So 2 things. Phil mentioned and the help at XSEDE reminded me. If you want to talk to me specifically about, or anybody involved with the CAC, about getting access to XSEDE or learning about XSEDE more, you can just send in a normal Flux support ticket at flux-support@umich.edu. You don't need to be a Flux user currently. Anybody can send an email to that address, and it will create a ticket, and I'll see it, and I'll get we can talk. The other thing about the data management stuff, again, this was a bigger thing, and again, Faye and I have already talked about this. For other of those in you, when in the morning opening talks today, remember Dr. Atkins mentioned something about talking to the library and looking at the library for actually curation, because a big part of these management plans is going to be curation, and that's a lot of people power. And at a national level, it may be difficult for something like XSEDE to provide that kind of level of ability. U of M is heavily looking into this, and I get asked this question daily, and something I have no clue. That is so far above my pay grade. But that is, people are worried about this, and people are working on it.
I just take a positive year and we are working on pilots for a long time. Hope something we have those to the library, hope we could sign it.
Nice, nice. Can you send me a copy of that? Thanks.
And things that happened locally, conceivably, through the campus bridging type initiatives, could be tied together into larger, a framework where it would be, integrated with XSEDE and accessible through XSEDE and that sort of thing. So that's another route that these things might take.
So we're actually over our time right now, but this is the last thing for the day, so we could probably take 1 or 2 more. But
well, I just wanted to mention really quickly too, if you're interested in joining a discussion too and talking more with, so there can be as many campus champions on a campus as desired. So anyone here could look into becoming a campus champion, and it's pretty much, I mean, you get plugged in, like Brock said, you get direct access and you get involved in conversation. We were just having a conversation with the campus champions about data management plans in NSF, and there's some people there who have, so you're bringing together a bunch of people with common interests through campus champions. There's over, I didn't put up my map, but there's over 100 institutions with a campus champion, and there's something like 130, and they're all IT folks and and faculty, and so a lot of common shared interests, and so you could really build a community that way. That maybe together, that community could also bring something to, say, NSF. And maybe work out. So we're actually working on that right now in Campus Champions, of forming sort of interest groups. And so, we'd probably be interested to invite anyone, whether they're a campus champion or not, who's interested in, the data management plan issue or, whatever it might be.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, well, thanks a lot. Thanks, Phil, for coming all the way out here from Utah. Yeah, thanks. It's always been a lot of help for me. Yeah.